A poor boy accidentally discovered an injured millionaire lying unconscious in his garden, but when the man's servants came to find him, he ran away like... The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows over the wheat fields, bathing the world in the golden glow of a fading autumn day. The village children had spent the last few hours chasing each other down dusty paths, their laughter ringing through the crisp air. Timothy, his small legs covered in dust, had been right in the middle of it all, shouting, dodging, giggling, until a distant chime from the town's clock tower reminded him that supper was near. "I have to go," he announced, brushing loose hay from his shirt. "Already?" one of the boys groaned, kicking at the dirt. "My ma will be mad," Timothy said with a grin, waving as he darted toward home, the scent of warm bread already filling his mind. The path through the fields was familiar, his feet instinctively finding the worn trail between tall stalks of wheat. He liked this time of day, the way the sky melted from blue to orange, the way the wind softened, whispering secrets through the crops. But just as he reached the last turn before home, something wrong caught his eye. A dark shape lay in the field, half hidden by the tall stalks. It was too still. Timothy's feet slowed, heart thudding. His first thought was an animal, maybe a deer caught in a trap. But as he crept closer, the shape took form. A man sprawled in the dirt, his face half buried against the earth. His clothes were torn, streaked with blood and dust. His breathing came in short, uneven gasps, and his fingers twitched slightly against the soil. Timothy froze. His father had always told him not to interfere with strangers. But this man looked hurt, badly hurt. "Sir?" he whispered, voice barely above the rustling wheat. No response. His heart pounded against his ribs. He wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The man's face was pale under the grime, his lips chapped. Timothy swallowed hard, then turned and sprinted toward the house. "Ma! Pa!" he shouted before he even reached the door, his small chest heaving. "There's a man! There's a man in the field! He's hurt real bad!" Sarah, wiping flour from her hands, stepped onto the porch, her face tightening. "What are you saying, child?" Andrew, already pulling on his boots, didn't wait for more. "Where?" Timothy pointed frantically. "By the south field. He isn't moving much." Andrew grabbed a lantern and strode out, his heavy steps purposeful, Sarah close behind. Timothy, despite being told to stay put, followed at a distance, his breath coming fast as they reached the spot. The man hadn't moved. Andrew knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers against his neck. "He's alive," he muttered, his voice low. With surprising gentleness, he shifted the man's body onto his back. A groan slipped from the stranger's lips, barely audible. Sarah sucked in a breath. "Lord, look at him." His face, now fully visible, was covered in bruises. A deep gash ran along his hairline, dried blood matting his dark hair. His clothes, though fine once, were torn and dirty, and there were scratches all down his arms as if he had run through the woods blindly, desperately. "We can't leave him out here," Sarah said, already moving to help. Andrew didn't hesitate. He bent, lifting the man effortlessly over his shoulder, his voice tight. "Get the water boiling, Sarah." Timothy ran ahead, flinging open the door as his father carried the man inside, the lantern swinging wildly in his grip. Sarah had already set a pot over the fire, her hands moving quickly as she gathered rags and herbs. Andrew laid the stranger on the small cot near the hearth. The man let out a low, pained sound, but his eyes remained shut. "Timothy, get back," Sarah warned, kneeling beside the bed, pressing a damp cloth to the man's forehead. Timothy hovered near the doorway, gripping the frame. He'd never seen someone look like this before, so broken, so lost. Andrew frowned, examining the bruises and the torn clothes. "He's been on the run," he murmured. But from what? Neither of them had an answer. That night, as the fire crackled low, Timothy lay awake in his cot across the room, staring at the stranger. The man shifted restlessly, his body lost in fevered dreams. He muttered under his breath, names and words slipping out like forgotten memories. Words that meant nothing to Timothy, but sounded heavy with sorrow. Timothy pulled the blanket up to his chin. He wasn't sure why, but something about the man made his chest feel tight, like he knew him, like somehow this man wasn't a stranger at all. The wind pressed against the farmhouse, rattling the loose window panes, whistling through the cracks in the wood. Outside, the wheat fields swayed, golden stalks bending under the weight of the night's breath. Inside, the warmth of the hearth flickered across the small room, casting long shadows against the walls. The faint scent of lavender lingered. Sarah had placed a bundle near the bedside, an old habit of hers when tending to the unwell. On the narrow cot, the stranger stirred. His fingers twitched against the rough blanket, a furrow forming between his brows. A deep inhale, then a sharp exhale, like a man surfacing from dark waters. His body tensed, muscles rigid with unfamiliar surroundings. Then, as if propelled by some unseen force, his eyes snapped open. Timothy, perched on the old wooden stool across the room, froze mid-swing, his feet barely touching the ground. He had been rocking back and forth, watching, waiting. Now, his wide eyes locked onto the man's. For a moment, silence. Then, a ragged breath. The stranger's gaze darted across the room, landing on the unfamiliar faces, Sarah standing near the table, wiping her hands on her apron, Andrew by the hearth, arms crossed, and the boy. "Where?" His voice cracked, throat dry. He tried again, licking his lips. "Where am I?" Andrew stepped forward. "You're at my farm. We found you out in the field. You were in bad shape." The man blinked rapidly as if trying to make sense of the words. His hand moved to his temple, fingers brushing against the bruises there. Sarah poured a glass of water and brought it to him. "Here, drink slow." He hesitated, but took it, fingers weak around the cup. He drank in small sips, swallowing as though each drop carried something heavier than water. After a moment, Andrew lowered himself onto the stool beside the bed. His voice was steady, careful. "You got a name?" The man exhaled through his nose, his grip tightening slightly around the cup. He seemed to grapple with the question, as if searching through a fog. Then, finally, "Simon." Andrew glanced at Sarah. She said nothing, only pressing her lips together. "All right, Simon." Andrew leaned forward slightly. "I'm Andrew, my wife Sarah and my son Timothy, who fought you yesterday. So, now can you tell us what happened?" Simon closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, his expression unreadable. I don't remember all of it." He exhaled sharply, his voice low, tinged with frustration. "But I know I was running." Sarah pulled a chair closer, sitting down. "Running from what?" Simon hesitated. His fingers tapped lightly against the glass, a subconscious rhythm. "From my home," he said finally. "Montgomery Manor." The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. Andrew and Sarah exchanged a look, but neither interrupted. "I was trapped there," Simon continued, his voice tightening. He shook his head. "She kept me there." Timothy's feet stopped swinging. He leaned forward slightly. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "Who?" Simon let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but there was nothing humorous about it. "Patricia." He rolled the name in his mouth like it was foreign to him, something he had only just remembered. His fingers curled slightly around the blanket. "My wife." A silence stretched between them, thick, tangled. The word wife should have carried weight, should have sounded like an anchor, but instead it drifted. Unattached, uncertain, Sarah spoke first. "She kept you there?" Simon's jaw clenched. His mind felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, the edges sharp and frustratingly incomplete. He couldn't explain it fully, couldn't grasp what he had lost, but the feeling was clear. He had been someone else before this, before Patricia. "She told me I was no one before her," he said finally. His voice was quiet, but there was a rawness to it. "That I was just a servant, that I was lucky she chose me." Timothy shifted, his small hands gripping the sides of the stool. He didn't fully understand what the man was saying, but he recognized something in his voice, the kind of sadness that didn't have words. Andrew's brows furrowed. "And you believed her?" Simon let out a slow breath. I don't know what I believed." He ran a hand through his hair, wincing slightly at the tenderness. "But I remember needing to leave. I remember knowing that if I didn't, I wouldn't—" He stopped himself. Andrew didn't push. Sarah stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her apron. "You should rest. You're still weak, and memories don't come any faster by forcing them." Simon looked at her, exhaustion lining his face. He gave a slow nod. Timothy slid off the stool. He hesitated before turning to the table in the corner where a piece of paper and a stub of charcoal sat. He grabbed them, then padded quietly over to Simon's bedside. Without a word, he placed the drawing beside the man's hand, a simple sketch of their farmhouse, small but steady, with a tree in the yard and a sun peeking over the roof. Simon looked down at it. Timothy fidgeted, then spoke, voice softer than before. "In case you forget where you are again." Simon stared at the drawing. Something in his expression shifted, something that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with belonging. For the first time since waking, his lips twitched into the barest hint of a smile. The morning broke gently, with the first golden light spilling over the horizon, painting the wheat fields in hues of amber. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh bread. Inside the farmhouse, the warmth of the hearth still lingered from the night before, but there was a quiet tension beneath the usual morning routine. Simon had barely slept. He sat upright on the cot, his back against the wooden wall, eyes fixed on the drawing Timothy had left him. The lines were simple, yet something about them felt grounding, real, a tether to something that wasn't lost. Across the room, Sarah moved about the kitchen, her hands working with practiced ease, kneading dough, stoking the fire, setting plates on the rough wooden table. Andrew sat at the head of the table, silent as he cleaned his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. Timothy, still groggy from sleep, swung his legs under his chair, nibbling absent-mindedly on a piece of warm bread. For a moment, it was almost peaceful. Then, a sharp knock shattered the quiet. Sarah froze mid-step, the wooden spoon in her hand hovering over the pot of porridge. Andrew's grip tightened around the handle of his knife, and Timothy's legs stilled, his small fingers curling into his lap. Simon, already tense, instinctively shrank back into the shadows of the room. Andrew rose to his feet, his chair scraping against the floorboards. He cast a quick glance at Sarah, who wordlessly took Timothy's hand and pulled him behind her apron, shielding him with the fabric. The knock came again, firmer this time. Andrew strode toward the door and pulled it open just enough to block the inside of the house from view. On the porch stood two men, their boots dusted from the road, their coats heavy and well-tailored. They didn't belong here. The taller one, broad-shouldered with a neatly trimmed beard, was the first to speak. His voice was polite, but cold. "Morning, we're looking for someone." Andrew leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "That's so." The second man, narrow-faced with sharp eyes, tilted his head, scanning the interior beyond Andrew's shoulder. A man, about this tall, dark-haired, might be injured. Andrew's expression didn't change. "I've been out in the fields since sunrise. Haven't seen anyone." The bearded man exhaled through his nose, unconvinced. "You sure?" Andrew's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Not much happens in these parts that I don't know about. If someone were trespassing, I'd have seen it." From behind Sarah's skirt, Timothy gripped the fabric tightly, his breath held in his chest. The narrow-faced man's gaze flickered toward him, his lips pressing into a thin line. Simon, hidden just beyond the curtain near the hearth, watched the exchange with his pulse hammering in his ears. His hands trembled slightly, fingers curling into the blanket, willing himself to remain still. The bearded man studied Andrew for a long moment, then sighed, taking a small step back. "If you happen to hear anything," he said slowly, "let Montgomery Manor know." Andrew nodded once. "Sure." The men lingered a moment longer, then turned, their boots heavy against the wooden porch as they descended the steps. The moment they reached the road, Andrew shut the door firmly, but without haste. Inside, no one moved. The air was thick, the only sound the faint crackling of the fire. Simon exhaled sharply, barely realizing he'd been holding his breath. His hands, still shaking, clenched into fists. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "They'll be back." Andrew ran a hand through his beard, eyes dark with thought. "Ain't no doubt about that." Simon swallowed, his throat dry. He met Andrew's gaze, his voice low. "I can't stay here." Andrew studied him for a moment, then shook his head. "No, you can't." He leaned against the table, exhaling slowly. "But you're not going anywhere half dead either." Simon didn't argue. He wasn't sure where he'd even go. Timothy finally loosened his grip on Sarah's apron, his small voice breaking the silence. "Who were they?" Andrew's eyes flickered to Simon before answering. "People who don't like when things slip through their fingers." Timothy frowned, but he didn't ask more. He wasn't sure he wanted to understand. Sarah finally moved, clearing the table with quiet efficiency, her movements tight with worry. "They know he's not far." Andrew sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "They don't know we've got him. Yet." Sarah met his eyes. "But they will." Simon looked down at his hands, his fingers still trembling. He had been so close to being caught. He knew what would have happened if those men had found him. He wouldn't have walked away again. Timothy stepped forward suddenly, setting something on the table. His drawing. Simon looked up. Timothy met his gaze, his small face serious in a way that looked older than his years. "You can stay," he said simply. Simon blinked. Sarah sighed, shaking her head at the boy's stubbornness. "It's not that simple, love." Timothy frowned. "Why not?" Andrew, despite the tension, let out a small chuckle. "Because the world don't work like that." Simon's lips parted slightly, but he didn't know what to say. Timothy didn't understand. He couldn't. And yet, he had offered him something no one else had. A place. A home. Even if only for now. The sky had darkened by the time Sarah made up her mind. She sat at the table, staring at the untouched mug of tea in front of her. Andrew was across from her, quiet, absently running a thumb over the rim of his own cup. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering light over the wooden walls. Outside, the night pressed in, carrying the distant sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. Simon sat by the window, shoulders taut, eyes fixed on nothing. He had barely spoken since the men from Montgomery Manor had come. Timothy, sensing the heaviness in the air, had curled up on a pile of blankets near the hearth, his small fingers loosely clutching the hem of Sarah's apron as he drifted in and out of sleep. Sarah finally broke the silence. "We need to go to Teresa." Andrew exhaled through his nose, not surprised. Figured as much. Simon turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Teresa." "My aunt," Sarah explained. "She worked at Montgomery Manor for years. If anyone knows what happened to you, it's her, even though she retired a few years ago." A muscle in Simon's jaw tightened. "And you think she'll tell me who I am?" Sarah hesitated. "I think she'll tell you what she knows." Andrew leaned forward, arms braced on the table. "If we do this, we go carefully. If Patricia's men come sniffing around here, They'll sure as hell be keeping an eye on town, too. Sarah nodded. We'll take the back roads. Simon met her gaze, something wary flickering behind his eyes. Then slowly, he nodded. The road to Teresa's cottage wound through the outskirts of town, hidden behind fields and groves of old oak trees. They took Andrew's cart, moving slowly, keeping off the main road. Timothy sat in Sarah's lap, wrapped in a blanket, his head resting against her shoulder. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Simon sat in the back, staring at his hands, fingers flexing unconsciously. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, about to look down for the first time. When they reached the cottage, Sarah climbed down first and knocked. It took a moment, but then the door creaked open, revealing an older woman with sharp eyes and hair pulled into a silver braid. She took one look at Sarah, then at the man standing behind her, and her face went white. She swayed, reaching for the doorframe as though the ground beneath her had shifted. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Simon tensed. "Do you know me?" Teresa's breath caught. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she murmured the words that made his heart stop. "It's you. You're alive." The silence that followed was suffocating. Simon's chest rose and fell unevenly. He stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the worn wooden floor. "Who am I?" Teresa's hands trembled as she reached for a chair, sinking down into it. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, shaking her head as if she could make sense of something impossible. "You don't remember?" Simon's throat felt tight. "No." Teresa closed her eyes for a long moment, as if gathering herself. When she opened them, there was something there, a deep sorrow, something that had been buried for a long time. "You were never a servant," she said quietly. Simon stiffened. "You weren't just anyone at Montgomery Manor," Teresa continued, her voice heavier now. "You built it." Simon blinked, the words striking something deep inside him. "You were the architect who designed the renovations," Teresa said. "You planned every archway, every column, every inch of that place." Her hands gripped the edge of the table, as if steadying herself. "You were Emma Montgomery's husband." The name hit Simon like a blow to the ribs. His breath stilled. His mind shuddered, something breaking loose, a door that had been bolted shut for too long. Emma. His fingers twitched against his thigh. He knew that name. He knew it. Teresa went on, her voice now trembling. "She wasn't just any woman, Simon. She was the rightful heir to the Montgomery estate. You married her. That house, everything, was meant to be yours and hers." Simon pressed a hand against his forehead. Something was shifting, unraveling. A laugh, soft and clear. Emma's. The way she would run her hands over the blueprints, tracing the future they were building together. The unfinished nursery was painted in soft blues and creams. Then, nothing. Only darkness. Simon's breath came in short bursts. "What happened?" His voice was hoarse. "Why don't I remember?" Teresa hesitated, and Simon saw something in her eyes, fear. She looked at Sarah, at Andrew, then back at him. "Because Patricia made sure you wouldn't." Simon staggered back, as though struck by something invisible. Teresa's voice grew softer, but it carried a weight that pressed down on the room. "Emma died in childbirth," she whispered. "And after that, Patricia took everything. The house, the money, and you." Simon's head was spinning. His mind flashed. Emma, reaching for him, her fingers brushing his wrist. But then she was gone. A void. His chest tightened, the missing years pressing against him like a fog too thick to see through. Teresa's next words cut through the haze. "She told everyone you were just a gardener," she said softly, "that she married you out of pity." She swallowed hard. But it was all a lie. Simon squeezed his eyes shut. His whole life, Everything he thought he knew was built on a lie. Timothy, who had been quiet until now, pressed himself closer to Sarah, his small hands gripping the fabric of her sleeve. His young mind didn't grasp the weight of the history unraveling before him, but he could feel the grief in the air. Simon forced himself to breathe, opening his eyes, staring at Teresa as though she held the answers to everything. Why? His voice was low, raw. Why would she do this to me? Teresa looked away. Because she loved you. The words struck like cold steel. Simon's stomach twisted. Teresa's voice was barely a whisper. And because she wanted everything Emma had. The room was silent, except for the wind outside, pressing against the walls. Simon felt hollow, as if his body had been carved out from the inside. A past he had never consented to forget was now clawing its way back. And for the first time in years, he knew who he was. The days that followed felt like moving through thick fog, one that clung to Simon's skin and seeped into his bones. He had spent the first night after Teresa's revelation sitting by the window in Andrew's farmhouse, staring out at the wheat fields, barely blinking. He barely noticed when Sarah draped a blanket over his shoulders or when Andrew placed a mug of tea beside him, untouched. The weight of lost years, of an identity stripped away and rewritten, pressed down on him until it was hard to breathe. Timothy, sensing something had changed, stayed close but did not ask questions. He only watched, his young mind trying to piece together the things the adults wouldn't say aloud. On the third day, Andrew spoke the words that finally cut through the fog. "I'm writing to Robert." Simon turned, his expression unreadable. Andrew leaned against the wooden counter, rolling up his sleeves. "He's an old friend, used to be a sheriff. If there's proof of what Patricia did, he'll find it." Simon's fingers twitched against the arm of his chair. "And if there isn't?" Andrew met his gaze evenly. "Then we'll dig until there is." Simon nodded, though the motion felt heavy, as if agreeing to something too big to fully grasp. The memories started returning in small, piercing fragments. He would be reaching for a glass of water only to freeze mid-motion, struck by the faintest echo of Emma's laugh as she once passed him a cup of tea, their hands brushing. He would be walking along the field, and suddenly the scent of freshly cut wood would stop him cold. Not the wood from Andrew's farm, but the beams of Montgomery Manor as he built their home, the home that was meant to be filled with a future that never came. He remembered Emma's hands over her stomach, the way her eyes glowed when she whispered, "He kicks when he hears your voice." He remembered the day he left, a business trip, something he hadn't wanted to take, but Patricia had insisted. "Emma will be fine," she had said. "You'll be back before you know it." He had returned to silence. Emma gone, their child gone, and then nothing. He couldn't remember grieving. He couldn't recall the funeral, the mourning, the emptiness that should have come after losing a wife and child. Instead, it was a blank space, a stretch of missing time that should have been filled with sorrow, but was only hollow. The realization hit him like a knife to the ribs. Patricia had stolen his grief. She had stripped him of Emma, of their child, and then taken even the pain of losing them, twisting his mind until there was nothing left of what they had built together. Simon stood abruptly, breath shallow, fists clenched. Timothy, who had been stacking small stones into towers just outside the farmhouse, looked up from his play and frowned. "You look mad," the boy said simply. Simon forced out a breath, unclenching his hands. He turned toward Timothy, hesitating before sitting down beside him. The child resumed his careful balancing of stones, tongue poking out slightly in concentration. After a moment, Timothy spoke again, eyes never leaving his work. "Did you forget something important?" Simon stared at him, startled by the question. Timothy placed another stone on top of the growing stack, then glanced up at Simon, expectant. "Yeah," Simon finally said, voice rough. "I think I did." Timothy considered this for a moment, then handed him a small, flat rock. "You can have this one," he said, "in case you forget again." Simon stared at the stone in his palm, something unspoken lodging itself in his chest. He gripped it tightly. That evening, as the sun dipped below the fields, Timothy ran towards Simon with a kite clutched in his small hands, the fabric patched but sturdy. "Do you know how to fly one?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity rather than expectation. Simon, still weighed down by the ghosts of the past few days, blinked at the kite, then at the boy. The memories of Montgomery Manor, of Emma, of Patricia's cruel grip, felt heavy and suffocating. But here was Timothy, 6 years old, holding something simple and free. Simon nodded. "Yeah, I used to." Timothy's face lit up, and without another word, he handed Simon the spool of string. The boy ran ahead, the kite trailing behind him, struggling against the wind. Simon steadied his hands, watching as the fabric caught the air. Then, carefully, he pulled at the string, guiding it upwards. The kite soared. Timothy whooped, his laughter ringing through the evening air. Simon, against everything weighing on him, felt his lips curve into something unfamiliar. Relief. For the first time in years, the sky felt open. The days stretched long and slow, filled with the quiet rhythm of farm life. Simon moved through them cautiously, like a man learning how to exist again. They were all waiting for the man named Robert, that Andrew trusted. It could be hope or disappointment, but at least these were still rare, peaceful days for Simon. Andrew didn't push him, didn't ask if he planned to stay or leave. He simply handed Simon a set of work gloves one morning and gestured toward the fence that needed mending. Sarah didn't ask how he was feeling. She just set an extra plate on the table for every meal, as if he had always belonged there. Timothy, however, made no effort to hide his attachment. He trailed Simon across the farm, his small shadow always at his heels. The first time Simon noticed it, he had been splitting wood with Andrew near the barn. Timothy sat cross-legged on a pile of hay, chin propped in his hands, watching intently. Every time Simon raised the axe, Timothy's mouth moved slightly, mimicking the motion. Simon set the axe down, raising a brow. "You planning to chop wood with your mind?" Timothy grinned, unfazed. "Maybe," Andrew chuckled, shaking his head. "Boy's got a habit of watching folk work." Simon exhaled through his nose, amused despite himself. He's going to be disappointed when he realizes this isn't that exciting. But Timothy didn't look disappointed. He just looked content. At night, after long days of labor, Simon found himself tucking Timothy into bed. It wasn't something planned, it just happened. Sarah had been finishing up dishes one evening, and Andrew was outside checking the horses. Timothy, rubbing his eyes, had sleepily wandered over to Simon and pulled at his sleeve. "You can tell stories, right?" Simon blinked. "Stories?" Timothy yawned, nodding. "You made big houses. Bet you saw interesting things." Simon hesitated, but then something warm settled in his chest. He led Timothy back to his small cot in the corner of the house and sat beside him. He spoke not of ghosts or heroes, but of grand staircases and hidden passageways, of rooms so tall they swallowed sound, of ceilings painted with gold, and gardens with roses that climbed walls like they were reaching for the sun. Timothy listened with wide, sleepy eyes. The boy didn't ask about Montgomery Manor, and Simon was grateful. For now, it was enough to just speak without remembering pain. When he finally stood, thinking the boy had fallen asleep, Timothy mumbled into his pillow, "You should stay." Simon's breath caught. He didn't answer, but that night, as he sat by the window, watching the fireflies blink in the distance, watching the golden fields ripple under the wind, he wondered what it would mean if he did. They were waiting for Robert. Andrew had sent the letter, and now there was nothing left but the ache of waiting. It settled like a storm cloud, always there, just beyond the horizon. Simon knew it was only a matter of time before Patricia realized where he had gone. But in the waiting, there was also something else. An unexpected stillness, a quiet place where he could exist without looking over his shoulder. One afternoon, he found himself gathering vegetables with Sarah. "You're better at this than Andrew," she remarked, brushing dirt from her hands. Simon huffed a quiet laugh. "That's not saying much." Sarah grinned. "No, it's not." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Timothy, he's taken to you." Simon stilled. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Andrew and I, we never had more children. Timothy came to us by chance, but he's always been different." Simon frowned. "Different how?" Sarah hesitated, then shrugged. "He sees people for what they are, not what they say they are." She gave him a look that was soft, but knowing. "You've got him tangled up in that heart of yours already." Simon swallowed. He didn't answer, but he knew she was right. That evening, the fireflies came out. Simon stood near the fence, arms resting on the top rail, watching Timothy chase the glowing specks of light. The boy giggled every time one floated too close to his face, swatting at them like they were teasing him. Simon had seen children play before and had once imagined his own doing the same. But watching Timothy wasn't just watching a child at play. It was watching a small, unbreakable force of light in a world that had taken so much from him. A deep, unspoken realization settled in his chest. He cared for this child, deeply. Not because he needed to, not because Timothy had insisted on following him like a shadow, but because somehow, in all the missing pieces of himself, Timothy was something real. Something that hadn't been stolen. Simon closed his eyes briefly, exhaling. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Patricia would be looking for him. But here, in this moment, under this sky, Simon was not lost. Leave a comment, egg, if you feel sympathy for Simon's situation. The knock came at dusk. Andrew had been whittling a piece of wood by the porch, Sarah finishing supper inside. Timothy sat cross-legged on the floor, tracing shapes in the dust with a stick. Simon was by the window, his body stiffening at the sound. No one moved at first. Then Andrew stood, tucking the knife into his belt, before walking to the door. Simon exhaled slowly. Robert. It had to be. Andrew opened the door, revealing a man a little older and broader, with silver streaking through his dark beard. His sharp, observant eyes flicked toward Simon almost immediately. "Robert." Andrew greeted him with a nod. Robert stepped inside, removing his hat. His gaze never left Simon. There was recognition in it, not because they had met before, but because he knew what had been done to him. "You're Simon," Robert said, not a question. Simon nodded once. Robert sighed, setting a worn leather satchel onto the table. "You'd best sit down." Sarah set out coffee, her hands steady despite the tension in the air. Timothy, sensing the weight of the moment, curled into his mother's side, but did not leave. Robert untied the satchel and pulled out a stack of documents, laying them carefully on the table. "I found what you were looking for," he said. No one breathed as he began. The first document, a ledger of prescription purchases, all under Patricia's name. Simon leaned forward. The dates spanned years. The handwriting of the attending doctor was neat and precise. Memory suppression treatment. The world seemed to tilt. Simon swallowed, forcing himself to speak. "She was drugging me." Robert nodded grimly. "Regularly. Small doses, spread out. Enough to make things blurry, to keep you uncertain." His fingers tapped the paper. "This wasn't just about making you forget once. This was about keeping you under her control. For good." A cold wave rolled over Simon. He had never stood a chance. He clenched his fists. What else? Robert exchanged a look with Andrew before pulling another file from the satchel. Emma's medical records. Simon's stomach twisted as he reached for them. His hands shook. He read slowly. Each word felt like a dagger. Emma Montgomery, age 27. Pregnant. 7 months. Complications due to excessive labor-inducing drugs. Simon's vision blurred. He forced himself to keep reading. Administered under orders from next of kin. Simon looked up, his breath shallow. Who? Robert's jaw tightened. Patricia. At that time, you were on a business trip to the city, and the villa was only occupied by Emma and Patricia. Emma was not stupid enough to use harmful stimulants on the baby and no longer cared about her own health. The room was silent. The truth settled like a physical weight, suffocating and undeniable. She had done this. She had taken Emma's choice, her safety, her life. Simon clenched the paper so tightly his knuckles turned white. She killed her, he whispered. Sarah covered her mouth. Timothy, silent until now, reached for Simon's sleeve, tugging lightly. Simon barely felt it. His mind raced. Patricia had made sure he was gone. The trip, the urgency, the insistence that he leave. She had planned it all. She hadn't just taken his memories. She had taken his wife's life. But there was one more file. Robert hesitated before handing it over. This is the part I don't know how to tell you. Simon's hands trembled as he unfolded the final document. The birth record. And then he saw it. The breath left his lungs. Simon Montgomery Jr. born alive. His heart pounded against his ribs. The words swam before him, impossible and undeniable. The child had survived, his child. He gripped the edge of the table, struggling to breathe. The memories he had clawed for, fought for, and suffered for. None of them had prepared him for this. His child had lived. For a moment he could not move. Then slowly he turned to Robert. Where is he? Robert shook his head. I don't know. Simon's heart slammed against his chest. What do you mean you don't know? Robert exhaled. There's no death record, no adoption record, nothing. It's like he just disappeared. A sharp, agonizing silence fell over the room. Sarah looked at Teresa, whose face had gone pale. Simon felt as though the floor had been ripped from beneath him. Patricia had his son, or worse, she had erased him. He stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the wooden floor. His hands were shaking. His entire body was shaking. Andrew stood too, steady but firm. Simon, we'll find him. Simon's breathing was uneven. He felt the edges of his world collapsing again, but this time he wasn't lost in the fog. This time he was furious. Robert straightened, his expression hard. This is no longer just a crime of manipulation. His voice was grave. This is murder, and it might be something even worse. Simon nodded slowly, his breath deep and controlled. He had spent years trapped in a cage of someone else's making. But now, he would tear it down. He looked at Timothy, at Sarah, and at Andrew. Then he looked back at Robert. We find him, Simon said, voice steel. And we end this. The night pressed heavy against the farmhouse, a quiet suffocation settling in the air. The revelation had shattered something in Simon, but there was still one missing piece. Where was his son? The unanswered question burned in his chest, even as the fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Somewhere out there, his child was alive. But where? The answer came with another knock at the door. It was softer than Robert's had been, almost hesitant, but it sent the same ripple of unease through the room. Andrew was already on his feet, one hand instinctively resting on the knife at his hip. Simon clenched his fists. Had Patricia sent someone else? Had she already figured out that he knew the truth? But when the door creaked open, it wasn't a stranger. It was Teresa. The older woman stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of her shawl as if it were the only thing keeping her standing. Her eyes flicked around the room, landing on Simon, then on Robert, then finally on Sarah. And then she did something Simon had never seen her do before. She broke down. Teresa let out a shuddering sob, pressing a trembling hand against her mouth. "Oh, Lord," she whispered. "Oh, Simon, She squeezed her eyes shut, tears spilling over the deep lines of her face. Simon turned, his voice raw. "What do you know?" Teresa shook her head violently. "I never meant to keep it from you. I never meant—" Her breathing hitched. "I was afraid." Simon stared at her, his body locked in place. His pulse pounded in his ears. Robert took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "Teresa," he said, steady but firm. "What are you saying?" Teresa's wrinkled hands trembled as they clutched at the fabric of her apron. "Patricia, she told me to get rid of him." Sarah gasped. Andrew's hand tightened into a fist on the table. Simon's world tilted. He barely heard anything else. He barely felt his own breathing. His child. Patricia had ordered his son to be thrown away. Teresa covered her face, shaking her head over and over, rocking slightly as if the weight of her own actions had suddenly become unbearable. "She said he couldn't exist," she choked out, "said no one could ever know." Simon's voice was hoarse, dangerous. "What did you do?" Teresa lifted her head, tears streaming down her worn face. "I couldn't do it." A sharp breath. "I was supposed to leave him at an orphanage," she said, voice thick with grief. "But I couldn't. I couldn't just let him disappear. I had to find a way to keep him safe." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "Teresa, what are you saying?" Teresa's eyes flickered, not toward Simon, but toward Timothy. The boy had been quiet. Too quiet. His small hands clutched the hem of his shirt, his knuckles white. Simon's heart stopped. Number Teresa let out a broken breath. "I gave him to you. Tell you I found him abandoned, and your couple has been childless for years. But actually," she whispered. Sarah's face drained of color. "What?" Teresa's voice trembled. "I gave him to you, Sarah." Her hands clutched the table, her shoulders shaking. "Timothy. Timothy is Simon's son. I told myself to keep quiet for the rest of my life, to take this secret to the grave, but when I witnessed Simon's suffering, I couldn't live. Silence crashed over them like a tidal wave. Sarah's lips parted, but no words came. Andrew looked frozen, his fingers flexing and unflexing, and Timothy, sweet, bright Timothy, stood completely still. His small chest rose and fell in rapid breaths. His wide, innocent eyes darted between them, his mind trying to grasp the impossible words that had just shattered his world. Simon was his father. Not Andrew, not Sarah. Simon. Timothy's tiny hands curled at his sides. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came. And Simon could not move. He was staring at the boy, his body frozen, his heart hammering so violently it hurt. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't breathe. The room was spinning, his vision blurring, his pulse roaring in his ears. Timothy, his son. A deep, aching sob built in his chest, but it never escaped. Instead, a single tear slipped down his cheek, unbidden. His hands shook, but he didn't move. Couldn't. Timothy was still looking at him, his small body trembling, his breath shaky, unsure. Simon's lips parted, but what could he say? How could he tell this child, this boy who had already given him so much, that he had been missing from his life before he had ever even known he was supposed to be there? Timothy's throat bobbed as he forced himself to speak. "I'm not your kid." His voice was softer than a whisper, but it cut like a knife. Simon flinched. Sarah immediately crouched beside him, cupping his small face. Timothy, love, listen." "No." Timothy shook his head, his face twisting in something too complicated for a child to hold. His little fingers clutched at his shirt so tightly his knuckles went pale. I don't I don't get it." Tears blurred his vision, but he furiously wiped them away with the back of his sleeve. Andrew's voice was thick. "Son." Timothy staggered backward, his chest rising and falling quickly, like he was trying to hold everything in. But it was too big. Too much. "I don't want a different dad," he choked out. Simon's stomach dropped. Timothy's tiny fists balled up at his sides. "I don't want things to be different." Then he turned and ran out the door. "Timothy," Sarah called after him, but he was already gone. Simon's breath shook violently in his chest. He swayed on his feet, suddenly unsteady. His son had just run away from him. Andrew grabbed his arm, steadying him. "Go after him." Simon blinked, still in a daze. Andrew's grip tightened. His voice was rough. "Simon." Simon swallowed. Then, without thinking, without hesitating anymore, he ran. Ran out into the dusk, out into the golden wheat fields, out toward the small, trembling boy who had just learned his world was not what he thought it was. The air around Montgomery Manor was heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. The estate loomed in the distance, a ghost of its former grandeur, its windows like vacant eyes watching the world in silence. The place was still beautiful, but there was a rot beneath the polished marble and sprawling gardens. Simon stood at the front gates, his heart a steady, relentless drumbeat in his chest. He had spent years trapped within these walls, years believing he was nothing. But now, he knew who he was, and he was here to end this. The guards at the entrance, dressed in stiff, formal attire, froze when they saw him. One of them stepped forward cautiously, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Sir?" He hesitated. I thought you were—" "Let me in," Simon said, his voice like steel. The guard faltered, looking back toward the house. "Madam didn't say you were expected." Simon pushed past him, his steps sure, his body filled with an anger that had been buried for far too long. He barely heard the hurried footsteps behind him as the other guards scrambled to follow. Inside, the grand halls were just as he remembered, cold, silent. A place that should have been a home, but had always felt like a prison. A shadow moved at the top of the staircase, and there she was, Patricia. She was dressed in an elegant silk gown, her hair carefully pinned up, as if nothing in the world had changed. As if she hadn't spent years breaking him down, rewriting his life to fit her twisted fantasy. Her lips parted in disbelief before curving into a slow, delighted smile. "Simon," she breathed. She descended the staircase gracefully, like a queen approaching her throne. Her hands reached out, but Simon didn't move. "I knew you would come back." Simon's jaw tightened. "I didn't come back." Patricia stopped mid-step, blinking. The smile faltered, but didn't disappear completely. "I know you're angry," she said, her voice soothing, as if she were comforting a child. "But you don't understand. You've never understood." Simon clenched his fists. "I understand perfectly." Patricia's expression remained composed, but something flickered behind her eyes, something wary. "Then why are you here?" Simon took a step forward, voice quiet but sharp. "To tell you that it's over." A slow exhale left Patricia's lips, as if she were relieved. "Then you do see." She stepped closer, reaching for his arm. "You see that none of it matters now. We can—" Simon jerked away from her touch. Her face froze, eyes widening. "I know everything," he said, voice like ice. "The drugs, the lies, Emma." His breath was sharp. "The baby, my son." Patricia staggered back slightly, her mouth opening in a soft gasp, but she recovered quickly, schooling her face into mock innocence. "Simon," she said gently, "you've been fed nothing but lies. You know me. I would never—" Simon threw the documents onto the table, the evidence, the prescriptions, the medical records. Patricia stared at them. Then she laughed. It was quiet at first, almost disbelieving. Then it grew, bubbling out of her like something manic, something broken. Simon didn't move. Patricia pressed her hand against her forehead, shaking her head. "Oh, Simon," she murmured, almost fondly. "You think you've won." Simon's fists clenched. "This isn't a game." Patricia's laughter faded into something cold. Her eyes darkened, lips curling. "Everything I did was for you." Simon's breath hitched. Patricia took a step closer. "I loved you," she whispered, voice trembling. "From the very beginning. I loved you. I loved you when you didn't know who I was, when I was only referred to as Emma's cousin. How many remembered that I was a Montgomery too, that I had a name and a right to receive this legacy or the love of a good man?" Her voice turned bitter. "But you never loved me, did you?" Simon's breath came slow and even. "No," he said. The word landed between them like a final blow. Patricia's body stilled. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, in a single, violent motion, Patricia grabbed the knife from the nearby desk. Simon's eyes widened. "Patricia!" Before he could move, before he could stop her, she turned the blade on herself. A sharp gasp, then the sickening sound of steel slicing flesh. She collapsed to the floor, the knife slipping from her fingers. Blood bloomed against the silk of her dress, soaking into the fabric like ink spilling across a page. Simon dropped to his knees, his hands pressing against the wound instinctively, uselessly. "Get help!" he barked at the frozen guard. But Patricia's fingers clutched at his wrist, holding him in place. Her breath was uneven and shallow. Her lips trembled into a smile, but her eyes were wet. "I thought, if I couldn't have you..." She exhaled shakily. No one could. Simon's throat tightened. Her fingers slipped. Her breath stilled. And just like that, it was over. Simon sat there for a long time, his hands stained red, his heart hollow. He had come to end this. And now, he had. The sky above Montgomery Manor stretched vast and unbroken, the early morning light casting soft gold across the marble columns and ivy-covered archways. The house, once grand and imposing, stood silent, stripped of the suffocating presence it had once held over Simon's life. Patricia was gone, and with her, the chains that had bound this place to its dark past. The legal process was swift. Simon was declared the rightful owner of Montgomery Manor. The town took quiet notice. People whispered in the streets, debating what would come next. Would Simon move back in? Would he restore the estate and reclaim the wealth and status Patricia had stolen from him? But Simon had already made his decision. One afternoon, standing in the empty halls of the manor, he let the past settle around him one last time. The place was still beautiful, but beauty meant nothing when it had been built on grief. He ran his fingers over the banister of the grand staircase, his mind flickering back to Emma, laughing as she ran down these very steps, her skirts sweeping the polished wood. He could almost hear the echo of her voice, the warmth she had carried into every room, the life she had tried to build here. And then he remembered Patricia's voice, the sharp edges of her whispers in his ear, her hands pulling him into a version of reality he had never chosen. Montgomery Manor had been a house of ghosts for too long. It was time to give it back to the living. At the town meeting, Simon stood before the gathered faces of the people he had once known, the people who had whispered behind their hands about him, the people who had looked away when Patricia took his name and buried it under her lies. And yet, there was no anger in him now, only certainty. "I am not staying at Montgomery Manor," he said, his voice steady. "It took too many lives. It's time to give something back." Murmurs rippled through the room. Simon continued, "From this day forward, Montgomery Manor will no longer be a private estate. It will belong to this town." Silence. Then, a collective inhale. "What do you mean?" an older man asked. Simon met his gaze. "The house will be converted into a community center," he explained. "A place for those who need shelter, for orphans, for families struggling to get back on their feet." He looked around at the faces staring back at him. A place where no one is left behind. More murmurs. Then a shift. People glanced at each other, expressions changing. Hopeful, cautious, disbelieving, but wanting to believe. Sarah and Andrew stood at the back of the room. Sarah's eyes glistened with quiet pride. Andrew gave a single nod. Timothy, standing beside them, held tightly to Sarah's hand. He was listening, watching. His small fingers curled against her palm. Simon looked at him, something deep and unspoken settling in his chest. Timothy had grown up in a home where he was loved. But what about the children who had not? "I was lost once," Simon continued, voice quieter now. "I had my life taken from me. But I was given another chance. And if I can do the same for others, then I will." Silence stretched across the room. Then, one by one, people nodded. An older woman wiped her eyes. A young father, holding his child, gave a small, grateful smile. A place for the forgotten. A place for the lost. Montgomery Manor would no longer belong to ghosts. It would belong to the future. The papers were signed. The title was transferred. Simon stood on the front steps of Montgomery Manor one last time, looking out over the rolling fields beyond. He didn't feel the pull of the past anymore. The house was no longer his, and he was finally free. The house Simon purchased was small but sturdy, nestled near Andrew and Sarah's farm. It had a sloping roof, a small vegetable garden, and a wooden porch that overlooked the fields. Nothing extravagant, just a place to belong. For years he had been adrift, a man without a home, without a name, without a past. Now, for the first time in his life, he had all three. But having a home didn't mean he would take Timothy away from his own. At first, Timothy didn't call him Dad. Simon never expected him to. The boy had known only one father his entire life. Andrew had been the one to carry him on his shoulders, to show him how to plant crops, to steady his hands when they shook. Simon understood that. He respected it. So instead, he simply showed up. Every day he made himself a quiet, steady presence. He worked alongside Andrew in the fields, mended broken tools, and patched up the fences. He helped Sarah gather vegetables, peeling potatoes while she hummed by the stove. He sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the fireflies blink against the darkening sky. And Timothy noticed. He never said anything about it, but Simon could feel the shift. The way Timothy would linger nearby a little longer, the way his gaze would flick towards Simon before looking away quickly, the way he seemed to be waiting, just waiting, to see if Simon would leave. But Simon didn't leave. One evening, Timothy showed up on Simon's porch. A book was tucked under his arm, his bare feet shifting against the wooden steps. Simon, who had been fixing the hinge on his door, glanced up. "You lost?" Simon asked, leaning back on his heels. Timothy scowled, looking insulted. "No." Simon smirked, then nodded toward the empty chair beside him. "Then sit down." The boy hesitated. Then, carefully, he climbed onto the chair, curling his legs up as he flipped open his book. For a while, he didn't say anything. He traced a finger along the words, turning the pages too fast to be reading them. Then, finally, "You ever build a house like this before?" Simon set his tools aside, wiping the dust from his hands. "Not exactly. I've built bigger ones, fancier ones." He looked around at the beams overhead. "But this one's my favorite." Timothy frowned. "Why?" Simon exhaled slowly. "Because it's near you." Timothy's hands stilled on the page. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Then, after a long moment, he tilted the book toward Simon. "Can you read it with me?" Simon felt something loosen in his chest. "Yeah," he said, voice quiet. "I'd like that." And so they read together, their voices mingling softly in the warm evening air. No rush, no pressure, just a quiet, growing bond. After that, things began to change. Timothy still called him Simon, but he started to seek him out more often. When Simon lifted heavy sacks of grain, Timothy would wordlessly bring him a cup of water. When Timothy struggled with his carving, Simon would sit beside him, offering quiet advice. And at night, when Andrew told stories by the fire, Timothy would glance towards Simon to make sure he was still there. Then one day, it happened. Timothy was excited about something, running toward him in the fields, his face lit up with a grin. "Dad, look!" The words tumbled out too fast. He froze. His face turned bright red and his mouth clamped shut. Simon's breath caught. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Timothy ducked his head, kicking at the dirt. "I didn't mean—" Simon cut him off gently. "It's okay." Timothy's small fingers fidgeted at the hem of his shirt. Simon crouched down to his level, offering a small smile. "You need help with that?" he asked, nodding toward the wooden figure Timothy had been carving. The boy hesitated. Then, with a tiny nod, he handed it over. Simon took it carefully, turning it over in his hands. "This is good," he murmured. "You're getting better." Timothy watched him closely. "Really?" "Really." And just like that, it was settled. That evening, the farmhouse was filled with warmth and laughter. The dinner table was set for 4, like always. But something was different now. Simon sat beside Timothy, watching as the boy chatted excitedly with Andrew. Sarah smiled as she filled their plates, nudging Simon playfully when she caught him staring. "You're quiet tonight," she teased. Simon huffed a small laugh. "Just taking it in." Sarah's expression softened. "It's a good sight, isn't it?" Simon looked around the table. Andrew, cutting an extra piece of meat for Timothy, ever the protector. Sarah, laughing at something Timothy had said, her eyes crinkling with warmth, and Timothy, sitting between them, whole, happy, loved. Simon exhaled, something deep and steady settling in his chest. No more ghosts, no more secrets, no more fear. Just family. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.